Hey, everybody, welcome to Tim's Vinyl Confessions. I'm Tim Derling, and my guest today is no stranger to any of you watching the channel, Mr. Martin Popoff, rock author extraordinaire. Good morning, Martin.
Yes, morning, Tim. Looking forward to this.
Yeah, you may have been able to ascertain by my background. We're going to talk a little Van Halen today. One of Martin's recent books is Van Halen at 50. This is the continuing series of at 50 or at 75 or whatever the case may be. But I was particularly excited to get this one because, I mean, huge Van Halen fan. And it's always, I like seeing what 50 events that you deem important, to talk about, past the obvious album milestones and things like that. So there's, you know, there's definitely a lot to unpack with this book and with this band. Because there's a lot of drama behind this band, like a lot of bands that have been around for a while. But with Van Halen, it's kind of an interesting sort of drama, a different kind of truth, if you like.
Yeah, yeah.
So I guess the first thing I want to mention is that, and you bring this up in this book, and it's a great point. Most bands, you wouldn't necessarily have to go back and mention every single album, every single compilation, and every single live album that they put out for 50 events in a career that spanned as many decades as Van Halen's did. But in the case of Van Halen, there just isn't that much stuff. There's not that much officially released stuff. And I like the fact that you commented on that. Like, there's a lot of gaps in between official releases. And was that one thing that did you struggle with finding 50 things? So you had to get all the albums and all the comps and live albums in there?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, there's only the couple of live albums and a couple of comps, and then they're not neither none of them are all that great, I suppose. I suppose the first live album's pretty cool. But no, it wasn't a struggle finding the 50 things. That's actually one of my favorite parts of doing these books. We've got the AC/DC at 50, the Kiss at 50. Is that all we have so far? I think so. But and the Bowie at 75, right? But that is one of the funnest things. Soon as I get the deal and it's like, okay, go ahead, start. It is one of my favorite things to do because you get to map it all out and figure out, okay, how many do I have left? And then I kind of break it into parts. And I started that trend. I don't know if the other writers are doing this, but I started the trend with having a song title as the title of every single chapter, which is always fun. But no, we always want to do every studio album. And in this case, like you say, there's not a lot of extra stuff as well. But Van Halen has this super interesting pre-debut history as well. Obviously, we've got the drama with the three different singers and radical changes throughout. A lot of family drama and trauma as well here. A lot of feuding going on. Reformations, breaking up, reformations again, sort of thing. So yeah, it was not hard coming up with 50. If I recall correctly, it was almost like that was about perfect. For me to come up with 75 might have been hard, and for me to limit it to 40 might have been hard.
Yeah. 75, you might have been stretching it a little bit.
Yeah.
Reformations, partial reformations, preempted reformations. I mean, it's quite a career. It's quite a roller coaster they've been on. And, as a fan, I guess, even though I probably started really listening to them around 86, and that was late then. Now I was only 8 years into a long career, right? With all the years that have gone by. And you make an interesting point. You mentioned the three different singers, and I really enjoyed the chapter that you did where you compare the relative success of Sammy as a solo artist, Dave as a solo artist, even Gary with Extreme, and how they all kind of did about the same amount of business on their own or outside of Van Halen.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, you think about it, and you've got, Dave had this sort of patchy career with I think it was it a double platinum, a platinum and a gold, or was it a platinum gold and a gold, something like that?
So the Crazy from the Heat, the EP went platinum.
Yeah.
If not double platinum. Eat 'em a Smile, double platinum, Skyscraper, single platinum, Little Ain't Enough gold, and that's it.
Yeah.
And I think that even, it's funny you mentioned, Skyscraper going platinum. Yeah, it sold 1 million copies, but in 2 years' time, I still saw Skyscraper in the cutout bins.
Yeah,
So
yeah, it
definitely
doesn't feel like
replaceable.
yeah,
And Little Ain't Enough, and then Your Filthy Little Mouth, those were kings of the delete bins for a good 5 years after. Like you'd
yeah.
see it, especially a Little Ain't Enough. You'd see those everywhere with a hole punched through it, whether it was the cassette or the CD. So
Yeah, and then Diamond Dave coming out through Magna Carta was bizarre as well.
yeah.
But
Well, then
and
you had
yeah,
the DLR
Gary
band
had
album, which wasn't even a band.
right.
But
Yeah,
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 yeah, very strange. The bluegrass album, the
yeah.
there's not a lot there to talk about. And then Sammy had this lengthy career, none of those Capitol albums certified. The only success he had was the Geffen years. I mean, Standing Hampton eventually went platinum, VOA platinum, and then Three Lock Box in the '87 album platinum, and then the Unboxed Best of went gold. Which my understanding that going gold was a major, that stuck in the craw of the Van Halen brothers when that was announced. And yes, a lot of dysfunction and a lot of things that unfortunately will go to the grave unresolved. You like to think that it's true that Sammy reconciled with Eddie, but you don't know. I guess something that's not necessarily to do with the book, but it has come up in recently is Alex Van Halen. I mean, so yeah, we already know he's got his autobiography Brothers coming out in the fall, but the him auctioning off things, and Mike Anthony has been quoted as saying, I think he's auctioning everything down to his last drumstick. So it seems like he's done with his music career. Is that I can't say that's all that surprising because he's never ever played without Ed. So
Yeah.
So that
Yeah, Jacques Van Gool over at Backstage Auctions is a good buddy of mine for years. And we don't talk a lot, but I always keep up on the site and stuff. But yeah, it's interesting that they are still going, and that was a neat coup getting the Alex. That's one of the biggest they've ever had. I think they did the Lydia Chris as well. I think they've done an Anthrax thing, but yeah, I mean, it makes perfect sense at his age and being a drummer, and it's like, yeah, it just seems. Drumming is a very physical thing. It just seems like, and we know he's had his ailments over the years. He's had his booze problems over the years, of course, as well. But to see the guy retiring or being done with it, I mean, all of us with these collections, we do have to get rid of them at some point, right?
Yeah.
In an efficient sense. So it doesn't. That part of it's not particularly strange, but more, I guess, regretful is that we didn't get much from him over many of the final years. So he was just quiet. He's not really participating in the world, yapping or drumming, right? I mean, he is one of my favorite drummers. It would have been great to have had more stuff from him, and it would have been very appealing to hear some things outside of Van Halen, because you know how hard it is to have a personality as a drummer. He definitely had a personality.
Oh, you could. It doesn't matter what album you're listening to. You just get the raw tracks, and that's Alex.
Yeah,
his snare sound, his hi-hat sound, his crash/ride cymbal sound, like that wall of sound that he produces. Yeah.
And I've always said that he's as big a part of the Brown sound as Eddie, and all the tinkering and the tone and I'm using this guitar or this guitar. I mean, to me, to me, the Brown sound means all of that put together. But a lot of it comes from the drums. I think that's just such a cool part of the Van Halen sound. Forget just the Brown sound thing, because to me, like, really, knuckling down and obsessively thinking about a guitar tone is just it's just almost too micro for me, too sort of like it's a complex, but it's still it's a medium mid-rangey tone, right? So to me, if you're going to talk about the sound of something in a band, I think this is a good case where it's like, let's expand the Brown sound to include this sort of the totality of what they did.
Absolutely. And if you listen to, I'm trying to think of songs by Van Halen that start out with just drums. I mean, AFU Naturally Wired comes to mind, Dirty Movies. You instantly know it's Alex. You instantly know it's Van Halen before any other instruments enter in. Yeah. And, but what was Alex going to do? Join another band? He's Alex Van Halen, like it just wouldn't make any sense. And he's never done sessions with anyone else. And Yeah, and Eddie's not done a lot, but he's done more than I think most people think. He got out there a little bit, but
Yeah.
But the dysfunction in terms of, you know, Dave, and then Sammy, and you know, one guy that in the whole Van Halen story that I've always kind of felt bad for was Michael Anthony, because he just gets not attacked, but you know, his contributions usually get denigrated in one way or another. And I think he's an important part of the Van Halen sound too. Maybe not first bass playing per se, but those harmonies, the vocal harmonies. So that's part of it too.
Yeah, and it's interesting. People have done. I even was sort of curious to see, even just recently, you know, well after the book came out. It's like, what are people saying? Like, what are people's sort of understandings of where Michael played bass and Eddie played bass? And it has been somewhat sorted out. Like it's figured out. You know, he's here, he's not here. They kind of know. But yeah, it's not particularly important. The harmonies are great as well. I mean, I suppose it would have been nicer. You know, it's a message to everybody in bands, I think. Just get out there and write more. Get out there and put your writing in there, put your 2 cents in. You know, at the end of the day, it's the most important thing you're going to be remembered for. It's fun. It shouldn't be that hard to do. But he strikes me as I've just noticed a trend lately where I feel like with some of these guys, it's just been a missed opportunity that you should, if you are going to be part of a band, you know, there eventually will be tension and rancor and resentment if you don't pull your weight from a writing end. Band people, you know, they're artists. Every human being has a lazy streak, but rock stars, you know, sensibly, I suppose you would think that they also have, or even more pronounced, have a lazy streak. And I've always seen, I've seen more often than not, you know, at the end of the day, after a long time, rock stars, even though they are the main writers in the band and they were happy to have done all that writing now, but they always seem to look back and say, I wish that guy would have wrote more so I didn't have to write everything, kind of thing, right? You do see that a lot, right? But then also you also see, of course, we know, you know, the many cases of bands. I think Queen is kind of like this, where everybody wanted to write and they were always lobbying for their stuff, and there was a competitive nature of getting the writing in. But I know, you know, I think of a person like a Richie Blackmore, and we know that he had the resentment that certain people weren't writing more, and he probably would have wanted them to write more, but he certainly did not want to give credit if you didn't write more, to say Ian Pace or John Lord, right? So this, we know, turned out to be one of the big problems with Michael Anthony and the guys, where they butted heads, and they were butting heads over him not pulling his weight as a writer. And fair game. I mean, it's like you should have tried to write more.
Well, especially the fact that from the beginning, they always credited all four guys that were in the band at any one time, which, you know, that seemed like, I can't remember if that was Ted Templeman's idea or what, but you know, when Eddie's coming up with riffs and then the singer's coming up with lyrics, and Alex contributes, you know, take not just his drum sound, but his drum parts. You take those drum parts out and it's not the same song anymore.
No, but Tim, even more importantly, often what happens in these bands is someone like Alex, I mean, he's in a special situation because he's the brother of the leader of the band. Although, you know, really, in a lot of ways, Sammy and managers and Dave and managers are as much leaders, because Eddie was a pretty peaceful, quiet soul in a lot of ways, right? And a true artist. But the thing that happened with Alex as well is he was well into the business side of it. And then he was also later into the album cover side of it, and he was big on the decisions as well. So he's kind of like a quasi 25% manager of the band too. And I remember talking to Poison before as well, and I know Bobby and Ricky and Poison had a lot of responsibilities outside of what they did. So generally speaking, that resentment will be less and it's good when you structure it this way, that it's okay. If you're not a writer, that's fine. If you don't want to write, if that's not your thing, but here, you do this part of the band, and you do
And
this.
this is how this will
And
balance
Michael,
out.
we don't hear about Michael having those extra responsibilities ever either. So it's like, well, yeah, I guess the response, I guess the contribution wasn't so great, right?
But was it a case of, either the contribution wasn't so great, or, he would come in and things were done already, or what have you. But I know that Sammy's had to go to his defense many times, when Eddie used to say, well, he didn't actually play. But, when you talk about albums like 5150 and OE812, it almost doesn't matter because you can barely hear the bass on those albums.
Yeah.
But that's a decision that came down to those albums were not externally produced. So, I mean, I know they got Mick Jones attached to 5150, but I really don't think he might have. I think he had something to do with Dreams, and that's about it. But I think the label said, no, you got to have a producer on this. So, yeah, I mean, there's, Mike's collecting his speedboats and stuff like that, and the guys are sweating over the next album's songs. You can understand where there would be a little bit of resentment, but there's, always another side. And Mike would have been like, well, I didn't kind of let me in. But, yeah, you just don't think of what kind of a lyric would Michael Anthony come up with on his own.
Well, and they had a bass player who did a lot of work, and his name was Wolfgang, right? And Wolfgang, a lot of credit to him. He said, his famous recent quote is, "My job was to keep my dad alive." Okay, that's one thing. But his job also was to make that album happen and that tour happen. And he's in there, semi as a producer and a sifter out of ideas. But he's also, when you think of that album, you actually do think of the great bass playing on it. He's a little bit of a he's a little bit of a combination of Dad and Billy Sheehan on that album.
Yeah, you listen to the beginning of Chinatown. Now, cynically, when I first heard the album, I'm like, well, Eddie must have played Eddie must have done the bass on that. But he's a talented kid. I call him a kid, relatively, and he's taken an awful lot of crap from so many corners unfairly. Even like in recent time, David Lee Roth just has gone off on this guy, and it's like, why? Dave, for his fun-loving California persona, doesn't seem like a happy dude to me.
Yeah,
seems like he's got a lot of resentment, a lot of anger, even though he's, Eddie joining the brothers made him a millionaire, made him a star, made him the reason people know who he is. So I've never understood where that all comes from. And yeah, it's just another part of the story. And you reminded me of something with Wolfgang, how I remember, that was 14 years after, Van Halen 3, the Gary Cherone album. And if it was for Wolfgang, there wouldn't have been that. Van Halen 3 would probably still be the last officially released Van Halen album if it weren't for Wolfgang. So I think he deserves a lot of credit.
And I love the way that like right out of left field, you wouldn't expect anybody, because this is a California band. They're hard rock, not particularly heavy metal. They just got this great Van Halen sound, blah, blah, blah. Haven't made an album forever. Don't really seem to care. I love how all of a sudden it's Eddie Van Halen putting his hand up out of everybody we would have thought of, who actually came back with one of the most pronounced heavy guitar comeback albums of any of the bands that we might have asked for that from, right?
Yeah.
It's like, it was such a cool surprise to get this absolutely, rockin' crazy, anarchic, heavy, long, substantial album out of that band. They broke every rule that you would have expected Van Halen to adhere to. We would have expected ballads and keyboards and Sammy and all sorts of stuff, but no, they turn in basically what is their heaviest album.
Yeah. Oh yeah. You listed like As Is and Chinatown and a lot of those songs. The drawback with that album, and I think this was Dave, as a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure I read that it was Dave, is the fact that it's the outlier and that it wasn't on Warner Brothers, and that's why you can't get it anymore. If it had been on Warner, it would have still been subject to all the reissue treatments and everything else that goes in consideration. But it's kind of like Sonic Boom from Kiss. They don't own that, and there's no real label that owns it. So it'll be forgotten, unfortunately, unless something gets sorted out and Warner does gain rights to it. But are they going to really try that hard? I don't know.
That's interesting. I've got a couple negatives about it. I mean, I remember hearing it and just being such a champion of it, and I still am. I still like it a lot. But the couple of negatives are because roughly, I guess it's roughly, I kind of forget now, but roughly half of it is fairly warmed over old 70s songs. In those half of those songs, I'd say half of that half sounds a little bit like barroom old rock and roll. Like it sounds like uh the dated songs on the first Van Halen album, like Little Dreamer and Feel Your Love Tonight. There's just an element of that bothers me. But the other thing that bothers me is I think Dave goes too far into the Dave persona, and he's just cracking one-liners constantly and making jokes. And it's the lyrics are too colorful, right? The lyrics could have been notched back 20%. It's not just don't keep trying to give us the money shot all the time in every line kind of thing, right?
Yeah, the clever Dave was at his best lyrically when he would kind of set it up like a joke, but it would be a long build up. Then he hits you with the punchline right before the chorus or during the chorus or something. But yeah, it's the way that it's like trying to read his autobiography. It's hard to follow. As a matter of fact, I notice a lot of the lyrics he comes up with on this album. I say, well, I read this in his autobiography. He's used this expression before. So, but yeah, I didn't like Tattoo when it first came out. I thought, man, we waited all this time for this. It grew on me, though, and I got to really, really enjoy the album. And yeah, a good half of it maybe tilts a little bit more like 7 old to 6 new or something like that. Again, though, without that starting point, I don't think it would have come out, because I don't think that they could have gotten in the studio and come up with 12 or 13 new songs. I think they needed that. But yeah, it stands to reason that the oldest songs, if they didn't make, well, the first 6 albums, and now they're using them, they're going to be even simpler than some of the stuff that ended up on those early albums or ended up on Diver Down or whatever. But
the first time I really felt that, as a microcosm to my slight reservation about A Different Kind of Truth, is the chorus to House of Pain, where once you learned that was an old song, I couldn't get it out of my head that the chorus sounded a little low rent for them, right? It was a little too obviously heavy metal. And even though I was a massive metal fan and I love my metal, it's a little bit of that Thin Lizzy Angel of Death thing, right? Where as soon as you hear Scott saying, it's a little cheesy heavy metal for us, I couldn't get that out of my head and go and thinking, Thin Lizzy actually is better than heavy metal. And all of a sudden it's like Angel of Death is a little bit of my Different Kind of Truth, just like the chorus to House of Pain is a little bit of a different kind
which
of
isn't much of a chorus, right? I mean, it's like they didn't bother.
It's da 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 da.
Yeah.
So it's a little Diablos in Musica, tritone Devil's Note thing. But the verse, when Dave's singing and you're hearing that chaos of that drum pattern and stuff behind it, that is super creative, right?
Yeah.
So you got this really creative verse, and then you got this low rent heavy metal chorus, and
it's all about that F sharp riff and the
So now I'm going, I can hear where and why this is a pre-debut song kind of thing.
Yeah, and then they there's another album they probably struggled to get out because Eddie was butting heads and but yeah, I mean, like, diehard fans that have heard all the demos, we know that House of Pain, the first time I heard it, it ends with like a horn sound, and it was meant to go into Running with the Devil, which is really weird. But and you mentioned this too, the laziness factor in Van Halen, how we love Van Halen, but they put out these short albums, and part of the albums are kind of not so serious, but it's this dichotomy because they're such a loved band. But you've mentioned this many times, which I think is kind of interesting. It's even your favorite Van Halen albums, it's hard to pick something that you think is an absolute 10 out of 10.
Yeah, it's true. Like, Van Halen fans are notorious complainers, and I am too. But I love that people absolutely struggle with picking a favorite Van Halen album. There's a few people who might pick a Sammy album, and that's going to be, well, even that. I've heard OU 812, maybe the least, but ballads
That's
evenly.
mine.
Yeah, and that gets
That's
picked a
mine for
lot.
Dave.
Yeah, and yeah, right. And 5150 gets picked a lot. But the funny thing is, from the Dave years, you hear almost an even split.
Yeah, I've
between
heard at one
between
time or another. I've heard all six.
Yeah, you definitely hear the debut a lot. You hear Fair Warning a lot. Women and Children First a little less, and I feel like I'm almost a little bit in the minority, but my favorite these days is 1984. I never would have said that as a kid, right?
Yeah.
Because it's the big one and it's a little goofy. I mean, they're all a little goofy, but this has what's goofy on this. So we've got Jump is goofy, Hot for Teacher is goofy, Panama is goofy, Drop Dead Legs is a little goofy, right? I'll Wait is keyboardy, not particularly goofy, but nowadays, I just listen to that record and think, okay, it's all originals. There's eight songs on it plus an intro. So that's good. There are eight proper songs. And lo and behold, something like Drop Dead Legs, Girl Gone Bad for sure, one of my favorite Van Halen songs. And I'll Wait. And I even like Jump a lot, and I like House of Pain. The ones I'm down on a little bit are Hot for Teacher and Panama. But that one that you mentioned, I mean, what happens with that record that I find interesting, and all of them are like this, and this is why people have a hard time picking their favorite Van Halen albums. A lot of them feel like Peaks and Valleys albums, where that one in particular, because that record, people who love it a lot and put it number one, and I put it number one for years as well, literally put it number one because they're blinded by how great Mean Street and Unchained are, which are the two songs that always end up at the top of the list of the top ranked Van Halen songs. Basically, those two songs are always way up the top of the list, right? So it's got that going for it, but then it's got a lot of goofy crap on it as well, too, right? So it's a true Peaks and Valleys album, right?
Yeah, and it's a short album. Like, I might be a half hour long if it's only just, right? But I think a lot of those early ones tap out at about 31, 32 minutes. Yeah. That's one thing about when, the Sammy years, they got a little bit longer, but then again, you're into the CD age, right? And having an album that feels, maybe feels overlong. Was there anything in your research for the book? I mean, I'm assuming a lot of it you knew, but did you come up with something that, wow, I didn't know that? Like, for example, when I read, I did not realize that Eddie and his wife Janie were divorced, and that there was a possibility he and Valerie might have reconciled, because I remember thinking, well, I understand she's there for Wolfgang, but it almost seems like she's just as much there for Ed. And I know they always were friendly even after they divorced, but I didn't realize that there was a chance they might have reconciled. Like, was there anything like that you learned? Like, I did not know.
Yeah, that is an interesting one. And then now we've heard recently, I've heard some rumblings that Eddie and Valerie weren't that close at the end, kind of thing, right? Kind of thing. So you never know what's going on there. But yeah, it's funny. I can't think of anything. I took out, I have my copy of it out as well, just in case I was having to refer to it. But let's not forget, my most scholarly Van Halen book is this one. This is a big book this is a long, wordy book, right? So this is my big where there's lots and lots of stuff in here, like a full timeline, loads of trivia in here, a lot of cool lists and stuff as well. But yeah, off the top of my head, just some of the early days stuff was interesting, sorting out. That was kind of funny, and there's no real clear answer. It's interesting to me when you do lots and lots and lots of research and you can't actually find the answer to certain things. So there are some months at the beginning in those Mammoth days and Mikey joining and all this where it's all a little hazy, right?
Yeah.
But granted, when you're just a bar band, a local bar band and stuff, it's like there is no clear answer to when somebody is in a band or not.
Exactly. Yeah, somebody could be filling in for 2 months, and then they figure, well, they're in the band. Well, at what point? Because you're playing, you're not going to say, okay, we're going to deem June 17th as, this is the date such and such joined the band, and we had a ceremony and a swearing in and all of this.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like you said, you can't find the answer. It's like when you Google something and you're on page 4 of answers and you can't find anything. It's like it's not here. It's not. There's no clear answer to be had.
I like when I like when I look up stuff and I'm reading something even on Wikipedia and going, oh, that's a really good point about that, and it says Martin Popoff in his book, blah blah. And I go, oh, geez, okay.
Yeah, or it's like when you read a news article and it all seems to be coming from one source. Like, okay, I'm gonna wait for other news outlets report this.
Yeah, you could tell. Yeah. You know what? And one of the funny things I've always found interesting about the Van Halen story is the way they paid their dues, right? Because it's such a bizarre way to pay your dues. It's one band that I think is kind of similar is Twisted Sister, right? Where you pay all your dues at home. You don't pay your dues after you get the record deal and go out on the road and suffer the slings and arrows of being like the lowly backup band and all that kind of stuff, and 3 records that don't sell and we're going to get dropped and all that kind of thing, right? No, Van Halen just became a minor local legend over years and years and years, and didn't go anywhere to get that place. And Twisted Sister's kind of like that too. They became this do it yourself. We'll go out and rent the hall and sell the tickets and get thousands of people out to our shows and stuff. And they became a working band that made pretty good money just by staying at home. And then they had their weird kind of rise, with the stopgap of the first album being
Secret Records.
And up and up, and then they get their deal, and
in their case it was just they worked so hard to get that deal, and in 2 years it was over pretty much. And so Van Halen, so they pay all their dues, then they get their deal, and then they're instant stars. They're one of very few bands, when I think about the classic rock bands in my collection, they're one of very few bands that were big right off the first album. I mean, I could think of like Boston and Foreigner, but there aren't many. I mean,
Black Sabbath somewhat in a way too, right?
Yeah, and Zeppelin, but not Queen, not Aerosmith, not Kiss, not Rush, not ZZ Top. I mean, not Yes, like none of these bands. But Van Halen. But you're right. It's almost as if Van Halen, due to the writing that they did do, because they were very prolific in those early days. It's almost like they would have had, like, say, 2 indie albums that came out in 75 and 76 or something like that before the major label debut. A little bit like Helix, maybe. But by the time that first album came out, it was, for its time. When I think about it now, for a song, their cover of "You Really Got Me" to hit 36 on the Billboard pop charts, that's a pretty heavy song for the time period. You have to think of it in context, and something that Greg Renoff talked about in Van Halen Rising is something that in the Ted Templeman book has how, and you've talked about it too, is David Lee Roth is such an unlikely lead singer, and how hard Ted Templeman had to work to get good vocal out of him. And it's almost like if the guys had any idea how hard they had to work with him, they probably would have said, maybe we need another singer, because it's not like, it wouldn't have been like, well, yeah, he's not a great singer, but we really like him. I don't think that's the case at all. I think that they thought, okay, the girls love him. He's got all this confidence. He's a showman. He'll get better. And he did, but he had a lot of help.
Yeah, it's funny. And you make a great point. It's like, they didn't even like him, right? So they didn't like him, and he wasn't a good singer.
He's an old buddy of ours. We're going to keep him, he's not, but you'd think if they had, you get the feeling that if they had any inclination at all, like, he's really not that good. He's taking forever to get one take of a song out. They'd be like, yeah, you're gone. We don't need to rent our amps from you anymore. So we really don't need you.
All I know is that Ted Templeman absolutely succeeded, because me as a kid of 15 in a small town in Trail, BC, and moving forward through the next albums, it never crossed our minds that he wasn't a great singer. Because he sounds amazing on the albums. And the other thing about the albums that I find interesting, or Dave's persona on the albums, he sounds like he has a very manly voice and persona and confidence. And he sounds like a good, he sounds like the oldest guy in the band too. He sounds like a leader, the
Yeah.
same way Bon Scott sounded like the leader of AC/DC.
He sounded, yeah,
being
the
older guy
wise
in the
old
band, the taller
sage,
guy in the band, right?
or
All that stuff.
Phil Lynott. I mean, you know, like
Yeah,
this is the voice of experience. This guy's been there. He's done everything. He's seen everything.
yeah,
Listen to what he has to say.
yeah. And you know, the other thing about the debut that I always remember about hearing that, because I can remember you know, myself and my buddy Forrest Duke playing that for the first time on his parents', you know, studio, big Yamaha CR 3020, 160 watts a channel, I think it was, Bose 901s, you know, beautiful carpeted room. You know, and I remember us hearing that, and we're already complete metal experts by this time at 15, and knowing that album was coming out for some reason, so there must have been some hype about it, or a couple of ads in a couple of circuses before it actually the album came to town. But I remember our thoughts were basically that there's some really annoying filler type songs on here that we're not happy are on here, but the songs that we like are as good as the European heavy metal that we love. And that's rare for an American band. You almost never hear that. I mean, Aerosmith, Kiss, Ted Nugent, Yesterday and Today, Moxie from Canada, whatever.
Yeah, they're all very
Triumph.
American sounding bands, but
Yeah, there's just
but
not
Van
a
Halen
lot of them.
does
Yeah,
On
not
Fire,
not a
Atomic
lot of
Bomb.
imagination in
Yeah.
their heavy metal, right?
Not a lot
But
of
then,
darkness.
yeah, but then you hear On Fire, Atomic Punk, Ain't Talking About Love, and there's one I'm forgetting. On Fire. Anyways, so there's one other super heavy one, right?
I'm the
But you
one.
heard I'm the one, yeah. So you hear those songs, and I remember us thinking these songs are as good as Judas Priest and Scorpion songs.
Yeah. So yeah, and it's funny, the dichotomy, they coexisted alongside Ice Cream Man and You
Yeah.
Really Got Me and Feel Your Love Tonight. You know, the funny story with me, and I'll never forget this, that when I first got the first Van Halen album, I got a cassette, and the songs were a little bit out of order, not like an 8-track, they were a little bit out of order. And side one ended, and I thought that the last song on side one was called I'm the One on Fire.
Oh,
I thought that was one song title. And I
Yeah.
remember, like, normally I'd listen to a tape, and just the millisecond it was done, I'd fast forward, flip the tape over, put it in again.
Yeah.
And I was hanging, like, probably magazine, like, you know, band photos out of Hit Parade or whatever. I was hanging a photo on my wall. I'm the One gets done. And then this other song, On Fire, comes on. I almost fell off the chair because it was like a bonus song. And then I realized, oh, it's two different songs. I didn't know.
Yeah.
I thought it was I'm the One on Fire.
funny,
I always
yeah,
thought that
yeah.
was one title. You know, the first, in all honesty, the first thing I ever heard from Van Halen was Jump. I mean, I saw the video. I would have been like 9 years old. And yeah, I mean, Dave just sounded like a fun guy, and he had, you know, sense of humor. And I think, you know, at that age, the thought of somebody being in a band and singing for a band that couldn't sing didn't occur to me. Like, that would never happen. How could anybody do that? Why would that ever happen? So it never occurred to me that if somebody were to say, well, he's not a very good singer, like, what do you mean? He's in a band, he's on TV. Like, you can't do that unless you're good. So yeah, it's really interesting to think about, you know, the ins and outs, the ifs, you know, that whole talk about, well, let's just get Sammy in. And man, you know, as big a Sammy fan as I am, I'm glad that we have the two. It's fun to have these almost two completely different bands to talk about.
And you know, the other thing about Dave as a singer, he really doesn't get enough credit because you know, on those albums, he sings a lot. He also has kind of like a seamless link between his crooning and his vocal fry, his singing and his shouting, his singing and his conversational talking. Like, he's a great stylist.
Yeah.
On top of doing a lot of singing. He's not a singer that you know, there are these singers that we complain about that sort of talk a lot through their, you know, off the top of my head, I think Ted Nugent gets a little bit of a complaint about that. You know, famously, Henry Rollins got a lot of complaint about that. Let's see, does Phil Anselmo do that a fair bit? Where it's where you might do your rappy, shouty, talking, singing a lot, right? But Dave sang a lot. I mean, there's a lot of Paul Rodgers in what Dave does. There's a lot of quick-witted instinct between using all these tools in your box. Now, as we've learned, I mean, obviously, at least on the debut, it certainly was not quick-witted. It was put together.
It didn't come, yeah, it didn't come naturally.
It was cut. It was cut from pieces, right? But yeah, I think we forget how, and he's so absolutely, he's not flat, he's not sharp. Across all those albums, you are never on the edge of your seat, wondering if he's going to hit the notes. It's
now live,
everything is picked perfectly, right?
Live was a different story, and I think that's a reason why we've never seen an officially released Van Halen live album from those early years, like the US Festival, or, in my understanding, like those clips from the Fair Warning album, the ones that they played as videos, they recorded that entire show in 81. That would have been a lot of fun, but then you think, well, maybe there's a reason. And then that god awful Tokyo one that they put out. I mean, that, but in recent months, I've seen this clip going around of Dave, I think on the Skyscraper tour, with an acoustic guitar singing "I've Just Seen a Face" by the Beatles, and it's fantastic. Like, he's singing really, almost as if to say, lest anyone forget, I can actually sing when I put my mind to it.
That's a great point. Yes, because I've noticed that with him, even when he was doing the Las Vegas residency. It was a residency, right? What is this, about 4 years ago, maybe, that kind of thing? But I studied like a good amount of a whole show, because there was a big debate going on in our email thing about how much Dave can sing. And the fact of the matter is, absolutely, he's got that Vince Neil problem where he has made a decision to joke around and miss the notes and not worry about what the lyrics are and crack jokes and just be a goofball. But it you almost feel like his reputation would be much better if a manager could have took him aside and convinced him, just stick to the script a little better, and people will think. Because what I noticed, even with that, is when he tried to sing, he was a great singer. He can sing. That's the wild thing. And
he's instantly identifiable. He's got that instantly identifiable tone.
But he doesn't have he knows how to hit the notes. That's the amazing thing. And as you get older, stay in your range, just be smart about it. But his problem, it was almost a distraction, the way he would distract you away from the role of a lead singer. And that ticked people off more than anything. Vince Neil's a little bit the same way. I mean, I don't want to really like champion Vince Neil, but I actually noticed so much of all the stuff we ridicule about Vince Neil all over the internet. You could take a positive view and listen to him and go, wow, he can sing when he wants to.
Yeah, when he tries.
Yeah.
I think Vince was a student of Dave's, for lack of a better, and a lot of those Sunset Strip frontmen were in the look and the sound and the humor and the one-liners. Nobody could do it like Dave, of course, but it's a shame that there wasn't more of that. I think that if a manager had made a solid point to Dave, because Dave's a smart guy, and said, if you sang a little bit more, you'd have more ammunition against the critics, and you love going against the critics. So
that's a great way of putting it. Yeah.
So that instead of just twirling the entire show or whooping and hollering, sing the songs as they are in the album, and then during the jams, during the your monologues or whatever, then you can have the fun, so that critics can go, well, when he gets down to business, he can sing. Other than you're playing a part of a recording, you're like, I can hardly tell what song that is, and I'm a big fan. It's almost, and fast forwarding, it's kind of sad. I just thought of this now, but that 2004 tour, when Sammy came back, it almost seemed like that's what Eddie was doing on stage, to listen to, some of Sammy's stories. Like, you couldn't even tell what song he was playing. And that was just, I almost went to that tour, but it was a decision and I went to see Rush in Toronto instead. And I'm glad I made that decision. I'd already seen Van Halen. But did you ever get to one of those Sam and Dave shows in 2002?
No, but I did get to, I'm pretty sure I got to, I can barely remember, but I did get to a Sam reunion show, and I did get to a Dave reunion show. And my funny story about the Dave reunion show is just on the street where I live, there was this semi in the basement, small, almost like a booth, like a jewelry shop, right? That happened to be a concert selling place, a ticket selling place, like an official Ticketmaster outlet.
Right.
I don't even know how I knew it was there. I might have just spotted the sign or something, and I walked down into this thing and said, because I thought, as usual, I could get a free ticket to anything I want, sort of thing, with a couple of emails or phone calls, right? But I thought, this is Van Halen. It's a pain in the butt. I got to talk to Warner, blah, blah, blah. I'm just going to go buy a ticket, right? And thought, I should go to this, right? I mean, it's historic. I should go, right? I'm not a big concert guy. So I go down and he's like standing right at his glass booth on his little computer. And he goes, oh, yeah, okay. And he goes, oh, you bought the last one.
Wow.
Like, I got the last ticket for an Air Canada Center show. It's like, you bought the last ticket.
What would be
like, oh, that's funny.
I mean, there's a finite amount. You just never think you're going to be the one that buys that last one.
Yeah.
It's like buying the 1 millionth copy of something. Oh, you just caused this album to go platinum. You'd never know that. But, at one point, it's like it has to happen.
Yeah.
But I remember
apropos of nothing that you just mentioned, that I'll always remember sitting in an in-person interview with Creed down at Attic Records in Toronto, and it might have been Aaron or somebody from the label opening the door and going to the guys, hey, guess what? Your album just went platinum. I thought that was pretty funny. So just interrupted my interview and opened the door and said, your album just went platinum. I thought that was pretty funny. So
yeah, I'd be like, I'm sorry, what was the question? Exactly, that Sam and Dave tour, though, still to me, like, that seems like one of those, nothing ever came close to where I was, but I remember reading about that and all these years later thinking, if somebody came to me and said, you know what, that was all an elaborate hoax and it never actually happened, I'd believe it, because that seems like such a weird that it ever got off the ground and lasted as many shows as it did, because they are so diametrically different. But what a cool idea. And I'm really,
the odd thing about that, Tim, I always compare it to hearing that there was a show on TV about the Ozzy Osbourne's family, right?
Exactly.
And I thought, I can't believe this is happening. Is this happening? This is just the coolest thing, right? And for some reason in my mind, I always put those two things together. It's like, this is crazy. This is what a really nerdy music fan would come up with. To think it's actually happening out there in the corporate world. This is bizarre. What they call
the Mandela effect. It's like, we all remember it, but it didn't actually happen.
Yeah. Just like when you hear things like I feel like so out of touch about rock sometimes, but to hear that it was Gary Cherone, right? Who was the lead singer of Joe Perry Project for a while there.
Yeah.
Joe, like things like that. Gary. It's like, wow, this is so cool that this is happening out there in the underground. I don't even know about it, but I just love it when weird stuff like that happens, right?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. Boston, they would have known each. I think Extreme had recently opened for Aerosmith, and that was another thing. I mean, what I guess. I've probably heard you talk about it, but what did you think? You wrote about it in the book, of course, but what did you think about that whole era, the Gary Cherone era?
Yeah, I did not like it at all. I mean, obviously, nobody likes that album. I don't think the album's very good either. There's no songs on it, basically. It's cool that we find out Eddie Van Halen's a perfectly serviceable lead singer. That's bizarre. But that was great. But and also Eddie plays the drums on it, right? I think he plays the drums on most of the album.
Which is really weird because it still just sounds like Alex to me.
I know.
I remember
what
thinking,
a talented guy, right? Eddie is. But I also just feel like he's the wrong choice because he's an East Coaster. He's a little intellectual.
Yeah.
And he's got these sort of effeminate stage moves. I saw that show too. That's right. I went to that concert as well. And he had those because I remember thinking, he's kind of got the same moves that when I saw them, one of my favorite cool concerts to brag about having seen is Extreme at Massey Hall with Saigon Kick supporting. That was really cool. But anyways, yeah, he's got this kind of stage manner, and the clothes he wore are kind of weird. But he's it's just such a different vibe with the East Coast Boston intellectual Gary Cherone vibe versus the Van Halen goofball thing, and it didn't fit. I don't think.
I remember thinking that I remember being because I was a big Sammy supporter. The one time I saw them was on the Balance tour, and I thought it was pretty good. And apparently they were, not getting along at all. But and then seeing Dave with them on the MTV Awards, and Dave was just, just such a goofball. And I remember thinking, this sucks. But then I got the best of, and I thought Me Wise Magic was pretty cool. And I'm like, oh, all right. And then guess what? Dave's not back. It's Gary Cherone. Now I like Extreme. I like Extreme a lot. And I'm thinking, boy, it seems to me those are, a lot of people didn't think Sammy fit Van Halen, even though they might have liked Sammy. Boy, I really didn't think Gary was a good choice. But as we know, of course, it was a marriage of convenience. They were both managed by SRO, and that whole thing is a conflict of interest in itself. When Van Halen had Ray Daniels managing, who was at the time Alex's brother-in-law, but that's a whole other story. But Gary, I would have thought would have been a much better choice for, if Brian May and Roger Taylor had wanted to do something with Queen, the way that instead of doing with Paul Rodgers, I would have thought, because after seeing when Extreme played the Freddie Mercury tribute and did that big long Queen medley, I'm like, he's rated home singing these songs, because not everybody can. But Van Halen, I didn't make the connection. That album, to me, I think I like 3 or 4 songs on it. I struggled with it. I wanted to like it because it's Van Halen, but I just remember thinking, this is just weird. Everything about this is weird. They got a TV, they got Mike Post, TV theme guy producing. It's not very well produced. It sounds like they were trying to get Gary to sound like Sammy in places, and you already had Sammy. Why didn't you just keep him? Gary didn't sound like he could be Gary on very much of that. I always thought that was just an odd chapter. The lasting legacy of that era is that it remains and shall remain the only time that Van Halen went out on tour and did songs pretty much equally from the Dave and Sammy lineups.
Yeah, that's neat. Yeah, it's too bad. And then there was, apparently going to be a second album, and then we don't know what happened to that. And and they spent a ton on the videos, or video or 2 videos. There's a whole story about that in there as well. But crazy.
So
I do love my Extreme though. Extreme is a great band.
So you do a chapter about an unreleased Van Halen album with songs that we know actually exist. Right. Which leads me to the question, do you think that we are going to see much for, newly unearthed, cleaned up material come out in the years to come? The way that after Prince passed away, all of a sudden there's all this, vaulted material coming out. Do you think we're going to see much of that with Van Halen, or is it?
No, I mean, Wolfgang, I asked him directly myself about that, and he demurred. He's a soft-spoken, very polite guy, but he kind of made his point clear that I'm not really in a place to do that, and it sounds like he'll never be in a place to do that. But yeah, that's just one of the great the great sadnesses of this whole thing is that Wolfgang absolutely. Had his relations been better, it's, for some reason, Sammy and Dave both have an edge to them, right? So it doesn't sound like they're going to be working together anytime soon, but it just seems like with computer technology the way it is, and even AI, God forbid, and all those tapes, and I don't, I don't understand why exactly Wolfgang thinks it's a travesty to, to go into those tapes and do things. I mean, you could put out your dad's vision, but I mean, I'm sure there's great riffs all over the place that can be repeated and parts that can be put together. He's a legitimate Van Halen member of a band, of the Van Halen band now. He's toured, he's made a great record with them. So and that's the other thing. I did a whole History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff episode of crazy ideas, and I think I even did one dedicated to the vocalists. But I basically have always been railing about the idea that while these guys are around and they can sing, they should be out there singing the phone book. They should be singing all the time. They should be singing covers. They should be singing originals, putting them aside. Use that voice, because that voice is not going to be there forever. And this is such a perfect case where both lead singers are still alive. And, and there's no reason to think, with a different mindset, there's no reason to think. I feel like they could make 3 45-minute Van Halen albums, no problem.
I think so too. Yeah. And how great would that be? Next year we get a new Van Halen album with Dave. Then the next year we get a new one with Sammy, and then maybe we will get that unreleased Gary Cherone one,
Yeah.
or a box set containing all of them or something. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, yeah, it seems like that the passing of Ed hit Wolfgang. Of course, it hit him hard, but it just seems like it's still hitting him hard. So I guess my final question, Martin, is about Van Halen. What do you think of the Sammy and Mike and then Satriani and Jason Bonham touring, playing that material?
I think that's great. I've never been much of a Joe Satriani fan. I listened to him and I think there's just not a lot of personality there, and it's kind of proven when he tries to write. I don't think he's the greatest songwriter of all time either. But yeah, I think that's pretty cool. And I've always said Jason Bonham is one of my favorite drummers of all time. And just to get a rise, sometimes I say he's twice the drummer his dad even was. And I kind of believe that a lot. I would love to do a whole show. One day, Tim, we got to get into this sort of mindset where somehow we can do shows and we can actually play music and examples of things, and we can do amazing shows that way. But
right.
I would love to compare all my 50 favorite Jason Bonham parts and 50 favorite John Bonham parts. And I think I could prove that Jason is like one of the greatest drummers of all time. Right. So it's great to have him as part of that as well. And yeah, Mikey can sing, and Sammy is just a force of nature to be able to sing the way he can sing.
They're lowering I'm noticing on some of the rehearsals that Sammy's posting, they're lowering the keys on some of them because they were pretty high, but man, at his age, he's still doing, I'm going to say 80 to 85% of what he could do, which is pretty amazing, that's pretty amazing thing. But yeah, I mean, Jason Bonham, I always tell people, and it's not to be provocative, I mean it, that Celebration Day, the reunion Zeppelin show, that's my favorite Zeppelin live album by a pretty wide margin. And Jason's got a lot to do with that. He plays those songs really, really well. I saw him do his Led Zeppelin tribute thing. He's great. So yeah, he's perfect. And because Alex, I think, got a lot from John Bonham as far as the snare sound and this whole feel, it makes sense to have Jason Bonham, occupying that spot. So, and in the case of Joe, they need somebody that has the chops, that can learn the songs. Sam, I just wish it came, somewhere around my area. I'd definitely go see it. But so there you go, folks. Van Halen at 50, the latest have you got any more at 50s planned? You don't need to tell me who, but
I have something planned. The clue is it's like an at 50, but it's not an at 50. The number is different. That's the only clue I can put out. So yes, I am. In fact, 2 days ago, I turned in the complete file. Or it might even been yesterday, actually. No, it was 2 days ago. Turned in the complete file. And I've also got another panel book through Motor Books. So another one where I've got some celebrities involved with it as well. Like the same way I did those ones in the old days all at once, where we had a Queen album by album, an Iron Maiden album by album, a Rush, somebody else, AC/DC, I think that's it. But we did a bunch of them there. And then when they stopped doing it, that's when I started doing them with my UK publisher, and now they've picked it up again. So I've got one of those. So I've got 2 books, well along the way, coming out through Motor Books that are going to be just like this, beautiful hardcovers, gorgeously designed, greatly curated pictures. I just love when I finally open up a book from, and Dennis, my editor over there, who does a lot of the photo work, and we collaborate on captions and stuff. He's a great music knowledge guy as well. So it's just a joy working with them on things. So I've got 2 coming out through them soon.
Awesome. And yeah, you mentioned it, and I need to parrot it back, because I love the fact that you use the song titles for each of the chapters, even though the song titles may come from something that has nothing to do with the time period you're talking about. They just fit. Like, you're talking about something, in the Dave era, and you're using a song title from Van Halen 3 because it works.
Yeah.
So there you go. So martinpopoff.com, go there to get all Martin's books. He'll sign them to you and stuff. Contrarians, History in 5 Songs. I mean, that's all the going concern. You've got your AC/DC, your Kicked in the Teeth podcast now.
Yep.
And I know you've got a panel book yet to come out that I participated in that isn't quite ready to go yet. So yeah, lots of cool stuff happening. Van Halen at 50. If you're a Van Halen fan from any side of the singer thing, or if you're just like me and you just like all of it, get Van Halen at 50. So Martin, thanks for taking a little time to talk to us today.
All right. Thanks very much, Tim.
All right, everybody, go listen to some Van Halen. Thanks for watching Tim's Vinyl Confessions.